Welcome. Thank you so, so much for joining us today from all over the world. It's such a powerful, powerful moment when we can be connected. Please, in the comments box, tell us where you are so we can have a sense of this incredible global community. We're here to talk about what makes travel epic. Welcome to our conversation. I'm really excited. I'm an author and a broadcaster. I'm also the first ever sustainability editor for Condé Nast Traveler magazine. It's a great honor to be hosting this conversation with fellow storytellers. It may not be their professional job titles like me, but believe me, their stories are some of the most powerful in reminding us how we can really make our travels count. I was thinking I should also maybe talk about the word epic, or one definition of the word epic is something that is heroic, grand in scale and character. And that's definitely what we're going to hear about, some heroic adventures. Thank you. First of all, there's going to be Joss Kent, of course, andBeyond's CEO, someone with a profound connection to Africa and much of the world and its people. Someone who's really brought to life, for me, the power of transformational travel on an individual level, and also is modeling through his business the incredible reach of an impact-focused company. He's going to take us to the Congo vicariously in a moment from London. Then we've got Beks Ndlovu, who is CEO of African Bush Camps. We've spoken so many times, and I've never yet had the pleasure of meeting him in real life, but this is almost as good. And just like Joss, he started as a professional guide. He'll take us today to Zimbabwe, where he was born. But I asked Beks where he spends most of his time. Where does he consider home? And he said to me, well, he's joining us from Cape Town. He said, home is where your dog is. And we've got Jason Kilar, who is traveler and former CEO of Warner Music. Jason has always been, he's been operating in the intersection of technology and media. He's the founding CEO of Hulu. And actually, he was an early member of this company. It's a sort of online, I don't know if you know it, this online platform called Amazon. So he's one of the first people to work there. We'll follow in his family's footsteps to Kenya. And also we're going to meet Bjorn Stauch. I'm so sorry. I'm so excited. I feel like I'm getting everyone's names as good as I can do. Leading the solution-driven funding arm of Conservation International, Bjorn has transitioned from high finance to conservation finance, and he's now modeling how to put money to incredibly good use. We'll join him through his memories of a really, really poignant, life-changing trip to Madagascar. Thank you. So first question, I think, well, all of us want to know, what is the most epic, goosebump-inducing travel memory that you've ever had? To our panel. Joss, tell us about your trip to the Congo.
Hi, everybody. Well, I'll take you back to 1994, Eastern Congo. Can you believe it? In those days, Lake Kivu. I was working as a professional guide, a bit like Beks, sort of learning the trade. And I was lucky enough to take Bill and Melinda Gates on an epic safari. The inspiration was the origins of man, and it was across the whole of East Africa, including the Congo. And we ended up landing on Lake Kivu in this World War II Catalina seaplane, which you can see top left in the image. And we went right up into the Kahuzi-Biega National Park to go gorilla trekking. And the reason this was a seminal moment for me was the photograph I took on the right was Bill Gates sitting on a log, staring into the eyes of a silverback. And for him afterwards, the conversation we had was, he was thinking back to the origins of man and the connectivity of us as human beings, hominids, back through the eyes of the silverback to the origins of man. But at the same time, he was also contemplating what might happen to the world in terms of the super information highway, as he called the internet in 1994, and the huge impact it would have on all of our lives and indeed the species amongst which we live. And I remember that conversation to this day, and how prescient was that if you think of what's happened since 1994?
That's incredible. Honestly, there's no greater aha moment than them deciding that they're going to really change how they use their money globally. It's profound. Thank you so, so much. And thank you to everyone who's joining us. We've got people literally all over the world. We've got Nepal, we've got Michigan, we've got Rwanda. Thank you all. We're going to join Beks, who is now going to take us through a memory to Zimbabwe.
Thank you, Juliet. I think for me, I tell the story quite proudly because it almost set off my career in the conservation space. Us guides often really get off on being able to tell our stories in the way in which we grew up. But I think for me, the biggest impact that this industry has had for me is the people that I've met all over the world. But it's been a partnership almost with colleagues being able to banter and tell the story, and in recent times employ and actually invite whole communities to be able to tell their story. And one vivid experience for me was in the late 90s, after all the rhino poaching was quite rampant in Southern Africa, actually. And back in Zimbabwe, the government did a very smart thing, albeit might have been a bit too late, but at least we were able to save some of the rhino that remained in some of our national parks and set them up into these highly protected areas called intensive protective zones. I so happened to be working in Matusidona National Park, which is alongside Lake Kariba. And I clearly remember one morning getting a message from the National Parks Rangers, very exciting. One of the first few calves had been born from one of the female rhinos. So I set off with a couple, and just to put a dateline, this was 99, 2000. And we set off on this very barely used track and came across this mother, and next to it was this tiny little rhino footprints. And you can imagine the excitement of this new baby in the national park. Anyway, we navigated through elephants, through herds of buffalo. And if you know anything about tracking rhino, you're constantly weaving your way through this habitat that's thickly woven. And in fact, one of the best things that you can go by is sound when they stop and chew on the branches, because they are a browser. At any event, one of my briefings whilst tracking black rhino is just like a pilot flies and looks for safe places to land in case anything happens. With black rhino is look for the tallest tree in case we have to get up there. Anyway, needless to say, the tallest tree around the area was barely taller than I was. And most of those trees were thorn trees. So this would get potentially quite interesting. There's a lot of things that happened in between, but at some point, a couple of us did end up at the top of these thorny trees. And that was the first of the real evidence of a success story, but also the beginning of a tragic story. Needless to say that calf was taken down by a leopard 2 weeks later. But the biggest threat that really came to reality for me is that today I go back to that national park, and sadly, that park lost most of its rhinos. So we were unable to win that war. And so, guiding for me has taken me throughout Africa to experience different parts of Africa. And this is a thread that inspired me to say, what is it that I can do, whether singularly or with others, to be able to contribute to a meaningful difference so that we can get back to those experiences, not just so that we can feel good about it, but for humanity. And consequently, in 2021, that same couple matched and bid very high on the safari that I guided last year, raising money for our foundation. So again, it's these partnerships with people that come to Africa that we form that span over 20 years, and we're able to make a difference together as a true partnership.
Thank you, Beks. Well, I hope people are feeling inspired. I have to say, I have once sort of tracked a rhino on foot. It is one of the most exhilarating moments of my life, particularly when it stopped and sort of shuffled around, facing in our direction. Thanks for bringing that to life. Honestly, I've got hairs on end thinking about how important these trips are and the work that you do, really. And what's really special about today's conversation, I think a lot of us watched a lot of webinars during the pandemic. And what's really special today is we have a traveler with us, Jason, who really is someone who went and experienced this. This is someone who isn't involved in the travel industry, but just can tell us from the heart how powerful travel can be. Jason, tell us about your time in Kenya with Joss.
Sure thing. And these stories are very reflective of the fact that what I found is when you set foot in a new country that's distant and new for you, the aperture opens up. And that was certainly our goal, Juliet, when we went to Kenya for the first time back in 2016. And I'm a father of 4 kids, and my wife and I thought it would be great to expose our kids to a different part of the world. So we set off for Kenya with andBeyond's help. And we arrived in Kichwa Tembo, a little camp in the Masai Mara reservation. And one of the things that we wanted to do as parents was to, yes, safari in the morning, but in the afternoon, we wanted to go and really get a sense of the local community and do whatever we could to expose our kids to it, and ideally, hopefully have an impact on us and our children. So we went to the local school. My wife and I proceeded to go inside to get a tour of the school. Very, very humble surroundings, but a tremendous amount of love that you could feel in that school building. And while we were in the school building, all the kids, this primary school, were outside on the pitch. And the pitch is maybe a generous term in this case, because it was largely just solid dirt that had been packed down from lots and lots of hours of play. And our kids stayed behind to play football with the kids there. And my wife and I came out to kind of observe and to kind of check in on the kids after about an hour. And we saw something that was, I think, very profound, certainly for my wife and I know it was profound for my kids, which is my daughter, Sadie, noticed that a number of the girls and a number of the boys either didn't have shoes or their shoes were absolutely not in working order. And so she gave her shoes to this girl and then went home and promptly started a shoe drive for this school. And it was a simple act, but I think it was an example of the power of global travel, which is it forces you to drop your ethnocentricities, which we have a problem with here in America, and it opens your aperture, as I said, to the fact that we're really citizens of the world. And it was a simple moment, and as parents, you dream about these moments. And I don't think it would have been possible if we would have, unless we had traveled across the world to little old Kichwa-Tembo. It was profound in ways that are impossible to say fully.
Thank you, Jason. Honestly, I find that really, really powerful and poignant, and something that you made me think of. I'm someone who has been a travel writer. I've been a journalist almost 28 years. And something I think is really important to remember, which you've highlighted, is, we often promote other destinations for travel as another world, but it isn't another world. It's actually one world, as you say. We're citizens of the same world. We're all part of humanity, and we're all interconnected. I think it's really important to remember that. So thank you so much. I'm really excited for everyone here, the audience, also to hear from Bjorn, because this isn't just a typical feel good, I had an amazing aha moment on holiday story. It goes deeper than that, and that is the power of travel. Thank you, Bjorn. You're going to take us back to a very important trip to Madagascar. It's worth the build up.
Thanks, Juliet, and thanks, Jason, for that story. It was really heartfelt and resonated with me. So, my name's Bjorn Stauch. As Juliet said, I lead Conservation International's impact investing program and funds. But before that, I was a banker for 20 years. All over the world, a long time in Singapore, and I remember I'm South African, based here in South Africa currently. I remember traveling back from Singapore to South Africa on holidays and over what was sort of the lush Madagascar, and always being so keen and passionate to be a tourist and a visitor in the lush rainforest that exists, and experiencing the lemurs, etc., for the first time. Anyway, as my career developed, I took a sabbatical and started doing conservation finance work for CI here in Africa, and got to go to Madagascar. And so we flew into Antananarivo, the capital, and we had a 10-hour drive down to one of the reserves that CI manages for the government. And honestly, for all 10 hours, we drove down and past brown rice paddies rather than lush primary tropical forest, and then all 10 hours back up again. So a sort of seminal moment in my life. Was I going to return to high finance, which certainly is rewarding, but for me personally, the journey took a different path. I either my path into green finance, conservation finance, was the most meaningful job in the world, or possibly the most futile, given the scale of challenge that we're facing. But I certainly thought, well, let me go down trying, and I've spent the last 6 years of my life doing conservation finance, which is trying to deploy capital to achieve environmental impact. Thanks, Juliet. Back to you.
Thanks so much. If we could actually really just think about Madagascar for a moment, most of us, or many of us, will know it. Let's be honest here. The movie, right? The cartoon. The reality is Madagascar is experiencing a climate-induced famine. Actually, it's the first climate-induced famine labeled so officially by the United Nations. So it's very profound. And knowing what tourism can do and what responsible impact investment can do is really, really important, you know. And I think it's a great honor to work in an industry where we can create great times, but also use that revenue in such a powerful way. We'll be inviting your questions. Please send us questions. We'll be tackling those later on. So as you have questions, please, we will come to those. Travel as a force for good. It's a bit of a cliche, isn't it? I mean, you know, everyone uses this expression. What does it really, really mean? Joss, what does it mean?
I think you're trying to connect tourism to conservation outcomes. In my view, there's a very real and very direct link between conservation outcomes and an effective, well-run tourism. And there's this sort of spider's web of connectivity between, say, Jason's choice to go to Kitchwattemba. His revenue that comes in does lots of things. It covers employment, whether it's in Beks's lodges or mine or other people's. It flows shared value into the community economies that sit around the camp. By literally traversing, if you went to one of Beks's places in Zimbabwe or Zambia, those vehicles are the land managers to a degree in terms of the habitats that you're preserving. They're the eyes on the ground. Through COVID, they were the only eyes on the ground. We were the only last remaining vigilantes of some of these biospheres we preserve, and the wildlife that obviously exists on those in those on the land or in the sea around islands that you're trying to preserve are being protected because the tourists are coming to look at it, and they turn into protectorates or reserves or places that CI might venture in to try and, you know, frontier conservation areas like Madagascar or Gabon, or what Africa Parks does in the Congo or up in Chad. So some people question, is there a direct connectivity between tourism and conservation outcomes? And is travel as a force for good? 100% it's a force for good. But it needs to be done well, and it needs to be done with respectable operators. And that's where this whole conversation comes in. How do you feel guilty about traveling? How do you know who you're traveling with? Is it a force for good? And I think we've got some great people on here who can provide some insight into that.
Absolutely. And also, you know, when we talk about travel and we're talking about the finance, it's not just that. And you guys all shared your stories of happy, you know, amazing travel memories. For me, that power of the storytelling and the experience, when I hear about, you know, people who've spent time with andBeyond, there's a great story actually about someone called Will Clothier. So he went to Pindar, age 11 originally. And he stayed in touch with the guide, and it became his sort of mentor. And Will went to Pindar. About 14, age 14, he decided, right, I'm going to study a wildlife filmmaking course in Bristol. That's what he said, 14, right? He took part in the Rhinos Without Borders initiative. And I hope, Joss, that you can tell us a bit more about that, because obviously during the pandemic, it was a really profound story. You know, sad aspects, good aspects, if you can tell us more about that. But anyway, so Will did this trip, and fast forward, he does a degree. He does a degree on I think it's you know, filmmaking. He decides, I'm going to go back. He gets onto this course that he's dreamt of since he was 14, inspired by his safari trip. He is going to go back to Pindar to capture the story of the pangolin very specifically, but COVID puts paid to that. So he pivots. He makes a film in the UK called Pete the Pond. It actually won loads of accolades, including Best Direction at the LA Documentary Film Festival. And, okay, so let's fast forward. He's now in his 20s. He's now working at Off the Fence, the producers of Oscar award-winning, well, you might know, My Octopus Teacher. So you could say that was inspired by his trip. So travel is a force for good. You know, it's so powerful, and the storytelling and the inspiration. Bjorn, tell us more. Okay, tell us more about the money part.
Great. Well, first of all, I must that's exactly what I agree and subscribe to. You must understand. Sorry, did I cut out? But you must understand a lot of the sorry, our connection here in South Africa can be spotty. The landscapes where a lot of this biodiversity is, where this ecosystem travel and tourism goes to, is primary and rural economies. They aren't in alternative livelihoods are hard to come by, and the revenue that is generated by sustainable tourism, as Josh mentioned, is to livelihoods, to the communities that depend on the tourism operators that operate there. So that's what we do as a conservation organization. How do we work with the communities who ultimately are the custodians and owners of that land to ensure a healthy ecosystem that can in turn deliver that wildlife experience that the tourism operators like andBeyond depend on to provide you, the tourism guest, that wow moment that Jason spoke about. So it is all interconnected, and the revenue generated by sustainable tourism is absolutely critical in these landscapes.
So I would just thank you so much. What I'd add to that, I'd honestly urge people to look at andBeyond's impact report. You can go online and download that, have a look at that. And it talks about 3 pillars. It talks about how your care of the land, your care of wildlife, and of course, your care of the people. I'm actually choosing to tell everyone about that, and I often do. It really is exemplary. And just a note, and I think, you know, obviously everyone here who's joined us from whether it's New Jersey or Canada, hi everyone, you know, biodiversity is one of the key topics in the climate conversation. And just to reinforce, you know, a million plants and animal species face extinction. We've just seen that even the koala in Australia has just become endangered. So with the loss of each of these species, really is significant. We're one step closer to destroying the web of life that sustains us all. So that's why this is such an important conversation around conservation. So thank you so much. We know climate emergency is accelerating the loss of all these species. Why do we need to do all of this? Beks, you're a big part of this. Oh, see, we had to have someone. It's usually me. You're on mute.
So I was just testing the rest of the world how good they are at lip reading, but evidently not. So, you know, I have a criteria when I go at least and try to operate in an area. And the questions that we're faced with is how much of an impact can we really have in the local space? And I really talk about a local space because if you are operating in close proximity to a community, that becomes your people, your community, your source of pool in order to create the magic that we all create in our camps, including Joss's camps. And we have this tagline, sharing and conserving Africa together. And the questions and the answers that we're looking for is how many people can we actually recruit from this specific area and transform them into people that are barely able to feed themselves, to people that are not only feeding themselves, but are supporting a whole community. The figures that we've heard in the statistics is that for every tourism job, that supports anything from 7 to 10 people. I mean, that is an impact. And if we're looking at setting up a place, we're probably looking at recruiting a minimum of 50 to 60 people. So you can do your sums there in terms of what is the impact in that community.
Beks, can I actually, because you've told me before about a project in Zambia and specifically about how you've really got involved, because you don't want to be going in there and just, we don't want to just be, it's giving money in a way that's really positive, but really empowering, but also offers dignity. Can you tell us more about the Zambia project? You were wowing me with statistics.
We set up Thorntree River Lodge in Zambia, which is really an iconic property right on the edge of the Victoria Falls along the Zambezi River. And we did a community needs assessment to try and find out who are the players there, what's everybody doing, And one of the things that we like to do is not take the path of least resistance, but have a look further inland at what is the community that gets the least attention within this area. And we've got different models wherever we operate, but that was sort of our take, is that Livingstone is a semi-urban, quite a well-developed area, and in a sense, quite touristy, the main urban part. And what we want to do is really look at the rural communities, because we believe it's in these areas where we need to not only conserve what's there, but start to regenerate some of these areas. And if you look at a country like Zambia, if you drive, let's say, from Livingstone to Lusaka, you'll drive across vast tracts of lands that have been cleared for agriculture, again, speaking to the human pressure. But you'll also find, sadly, huge big bags of charcoal of these huge big indigenous trees that have been burnt, fields cleared to sell as a source of fuel. And so we looked at all of this and said, well, we need to look probably for the hardest village or community for any tourist to get to. Slightly inconvenient, because we can't just take our guests over there very quickly. In fact, it's going to be a 45 to 1 hour journey. In some of our locations, it's a 2-year journey, 2-hour journeys. So having looked at this, Maunga community has about 200 kids. And we had an assessment to this and noticed that the school attendance levels were terrible, were less than 5%. But you had dribbles of school kids coming in, 200 kids. They had barely any health facilities. The women and the mothers of these communities would either die at childbirth or lose their children because of very poor health facilities. They hardly had running water. And we took a look at all of this and said, well, the first thing we need to do before anything else is sort out the health facilities. So we built a clinic and have staffed it with 2 nurses. That now has transformed the lives of particularly the women and children in that particular community. But we've also interrogated what stops these children from attending to school. So we provided, and not something that typically we would do, but we realized if a child is going to walk anything from 5 to 10 kilometers on an empty stomach, A, they're not going to concentrate when they get there. And secondly, they're just not going to be interested. So we provided 1 meal a day. And today, we have an increasing pass rate. We have running water, something that is a basic human right, which is access to the internet. They're now able to do that. They're now able to have that. And so there are all of these things that very slowly we're transforming a very impoverished community that has cleared. I mean, you drive there and there are piles and piles of wood simmering under the coals to create charcoal. And some of the conversations that we're having is how can we get our guests involved when they're burning all of this carbon to get to us, to actually part of how can we give these communities and empower having them get trees and start planting trees to try and regenerate some of that woodland and some of those areas that have been destroyed. But not just expect them to do this for free, but actually pay them for those services and pay them for being able to regenerate the environment that we all exist, that we all depend on. So it's these transformations of land, of wildlife, and the people that we make those assessments as to whether we should go into an area or not. And that's why we do tourism. And in fact, I often joke about this and say the tourism is secondary to the purpose that we have, which is sharing and conserving to Africa. And tourism happens to be the perfect vehicle that can allow us to do that and invite people from all walks of life to be custodians of what I call the vital organs of the planet.
So, I mean, that's a wonderful way of really showing how, there's so much there, the behavioral change, also the sort of education about why that needs to be done. Presumably that's really happening with the guests, with the local community. You use the word custodians. I think that's it's such an important word. I know that Jason, when you went on your trip, this is exactly the kind of sort of activity or behavior you were experiencing. How did it affect how you maybe ran your own businesses or how you ran business when you went back? Because obviously, typically in America, I know that people often consider shareholders, but now, what we're hearing are stories of everybody being a stakeholder and everyone caring about all of them. For
sure, Juliet. I mean, it can't help but change you. And if there was one sort of thing I wish I could do is with regards to this topic, is I wish everyone in America could literally go and spend a couple of weeks in Kenya or Botswana or Namibia or anywhere in Africa, because I think it changes your perspective for the better while not changing the environment for the worse. in all the ways that Joss and Beks and Bjorn were talking about. Yes, there's economics that are brought to the local communities because of travelers and their spend and investment. But I actually think, what the travelers take is actually probably more impactful in the long term, which is a fundamental change in perspective. And so you asked about how that impacted me and how that impacts how I run businesses. I think it's fair to say that I define myself first and foremost as a citizen of the world. And so, this will get a little bit back to movies and television series, as you brought up earlier in the talk, that, at Warner Media, one of the services that we focus greatly on was a service called HBO Max. And I'd say that, probably a couple of decades ago, it would be very normal to take a service like that to America, to Western Europe, and maybe to Australia, New Zealand. But Africa wouldn't necessarily be on the radar. And yet one of the things that was very important to me is that we had a game plan for bringing HBO Max to Europe, to the continent, in addition to other places around the world. And that's just like one small example where once you've experienced it, once you've accessed it, you can't help but have your aperture open to the way the world exists. And you want to do all you can to serve them, including folks in Africa and all over the world. So that's just one small example of how, my exposure to the great people in Africa, had changed how I thought about business, back here in California.
Thanks. I'm going to ask you another question, actually, lead into a question for everyone to think about, because obviously when we talk about these, sustainable luxury, we'll use that term, these trips, can you have both? And do people still worry? And this may spark some questions from the audience, but, if you're someone who saved up, you want to go, or you're spending lots on this amazing trip of a lifetime, are you a bit concerned that sometimes are people concerned that all this good might come at a cost to their comfort? I mean, dare we say that? How did you feel, Jason? Do you feel that, can you be having this very responsible, ethical, sustainable, good trip? Is that anything you have to sacrifice?
Yeah, no, it's the question. And I think where it starts is, who you choose to partner with as a traveler. And I've kind of known Joss Kent for many, many years. And so one of the things I always got a kick out of is when his eyes would lighten up when he talked about the mission of andBeyond, which was so much more than just a hospitality mission. It really was all the other things that we've talked about on this webcast, which is literally using travel as a means to do something else. Because at the end of the day, as Joss has reminded me many times, you can't just rely on philanthropy. You can't just rely on grants. It turns out that capitalism, sustainable capitalism, is an incredible means to which you can actually change things for the better and for the long term. So to your question about the luxury of it all and this, that, and the other, I think it really comes down to people like Beks and Joss who think very carefully about how to deliver that in a way that is sustainable and ultimately leads to positive impact on the environment because of the resources that are brought to bear that can change things like water safety and security and education. And I've seen it with my own eyes, throughout Kenya and Tanzania, where that direct impact of capitalism, because of the luxury, level of accommodations, absolutely changes communities for the better. So I'm not the expert on that. I'll defer to the rest of the folks on this call. But I think it really comes down to who you choose to partner with. And if you choose ethical and honorable people, I think it's a strategy that absolutely is a robust one that can last for the long term.
And thank you. And I think we just need to really redefine the word luxury. For me, luxury shouldn't be about excess consumption and terrible things. It should be about feeling good. And for me, rare. I mean, if you look at the origin of the word luxury, it's these rare experiences that are enriching in themselves. So yeah, Joss, what do you think? Is there a cost to comfort?
Yeah, absolutely not. You do not need to trade in luxury or whatever your definition of comfort or luxury is for a high impact experience. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, I've just come back from New York. I had a chance to stay in a world famous hotel, which I don't often do. It was Ritz-Carlton in New York, right in Central Park. It struck me after 2 days of being there was like, okay, I'm going to put up one of our lodges, or you could put up any of Beks's either. So andBeyond Sossusvlei Desert Lodge, very delicate ecosystem. One footprint will last 400 years if you step off the track in the desert, in the Namib Desert. That is $1,500 a night with andBeyond. The Ritz-Carlton, by the time you've played all the F&B and everything, is actually $3,000 a night, which I wasn't playing, thank goodness. But it was full, absolutely full. When I look at those experiences, you'd say, okay, well, Ritz-Carlton is luxury defined as you put it in this comfort, luxury, etc.
Can I just ask, I mean, do you think different ages, different generations respond? No. Do they have different expectations? Yeah.
Let me just finish the comparison. So I just sat there going, okay, well, what's the difference here between with this question that you put? andBeyond Sossusvlei Desert Lodge, 70 to 75% renewable energy, solar. Beks is super strong on his renewable energy. Most of his camps are on solar. I know that. And grey water reticulation, 90% grey water reticulation in the desert because we want to reuse everything. We got zero plastic. I mean, zero plastic in the lodge, and we're probably about 38% up the supply chain. Yeah, getting plastic out of the supply chain before it even hits the lodge. And you can go on. We've got about 76, 80% local employment. We've got about 73% local supplier purchasing. That's within 50 kilometers of the lodge. A bit extended in Namibia because a lot comes from Windhoek. I then looked at the Ritz-Carlton, no renewable energy, plastic everywhere, no biosphere influence. They're not actually preserving anything unless they think they're preserving something in Central Park. No water preservation. You could just turn the taps on and run the whole of New York dry for the 3 days I was there. In fact, they probably encourage you to do it. So I guess I look at it from the lens of defining what that is. And I 100% would put up one of African bush camps or an andBeyond lodge against what the traditional definition of luxury or comfort is. And so you tell me, go and experience pound for pound, and have you given it anything up by making a choice between staying, I don't mean to beat up Ritz-Carlton, but between this operator and that operator in your consumer choice at any age bracket, whether you're a millennial, Gen Z, boomer, etc. And I think increasingly consumers are making those choices. They are looking for the operator where if they're going to spend that kind of money, that they are choosing the right people to do it with. So I think there's a responsibility here. And I don't see it strongly in a lot of other places. I think Africa is one of its greatest exports is its capability in this area, and it's undersold.
So maybe I can just add to what I think Joss really put that quite well there. I mean, we've got two people here that we can talk about in terms of making their choices. In Jason's case, he makes his choices. Where do I travel? He asks the right questions. And more we're finding our audience is asking the right questions. Where am I going to spend my money and where is it going? You know, there's this whole thing of travel shaming or carbon shaming. And I think people want to know that wherever they go, their money is going to be put or employed into good use. And we're not saying that these are the only people we want to have in our camps, but we're saying as people in our industry, we're doing our utmost to make sure that we are educating people to be aware that these are the choices that they can make, and they can all make a contributing difference by making those right choices. And on the other hand, when it comes to Jason, you know, in terms of who does he fund? Where does his capital go to? He's got the model of the green capital, and he is going to help safari operators like ourselves develop infrastructure and support communities because of the good that we're doing. So it's a whole full circle of having these partnerships so that strategically will all help us achieve a better planet.
And as you say, in terms of looking at where the money's going and ownership, I think a lot of people are waking up. And that's why, you know, when I say about generationally, I think that the younger travelers, so tomorrow's, you know, high-end luxury traveler is much more aware. So you mentioned the Ritz-Carlton. I don't know how many people in the audience, do you know who owns the Ritz-Carlton? Do you know it's owned by Marriott, really? So it's just people are waking up to exactly as you say, who owns it? Why do they run this business? Where's the money going? Yeah, are there any other comments you want to make on how people respond? I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the Ritz-Carlton and you talked about water in New York. People often in well, in the Americas, or certainly in UK, where it's raining now, we don't think about water, but we realize, you know, Africa, many of the African countries already know this is one of the biggest crises. So you've woken up to it. And it's, I think we want hotel groups that reflect our values. So I don't know if that's another consideration, Joss. You know, are you staying in a hotel that reflects your values?
Totally. And I think increasingly you'll just see that with the demographic shift. We're already seeing it in andBeyond in terms of those kind of Gen Z, millennial, you know, they're increasing and they're very demanding when it comes to these questions. And you're not going to fob them off with an impact review, because they'll check that. And they can check that on TripAdvisor. They can check it on any of the multiple platforms. So there's no point trying to, you know, we can go into a whole conversation about greenwashing and everything. If you're going to put your label up and say you're doing this sustainably and with impact, you better mean it. Or you're going to get caught out.
Totally. I mean, we're hearing the word sustainability all the time. I think we're almost at risk of being like, oh, sustainability, what does it even mean? I just hear this word so often. I mean, what should it mean? What should the word sustainability mean, do you think? Anyone? Who's going to answer that? Who feels eager?
I'll throw it out there, which is, I just think sustainability means treading lightly and leaving this world in a better position than when you found it. And I think Beks and Joss and many, many others are doing just that. You know, which is, you know, do you have a model that is robust and can survive boom times and bust times? And this gets back to the comment about, and this is not about, you know, depending on, you know, the benevolence and grants and philanthropy. That's very, very important and it's helpful. But having something that's sustainable means that, you know, Beks and Joss are in control of their own destinies. And I think that's to me what sustainable is when you ask that question, Juliet.
Yeah, and for me, it's simply, you know, doing more positive, more good than negative. Obviously, Bjorn, conservation, that's a key one, isn't it? Being a nature positive business. And Joss, I mean,
yeah, if we've lost Bjorn, is one of the things we're finding is we're nearly beyond sustainability. Certainly in the way we're kind of thinking, the absolute shared value and true shared value of outcomes is critical. We can get romantic and about community visits, to be blunt, you know, going into a clinic or to a school. If these places to endure, there has to be equal shared value between local communities, governments, and the value attributable to private operators, and indeed the experience that you give to guests. There's shared value in all those things. Now, that care of land, wildlife, and people is a template through which we try to do that. But going forward, you're going to see communities not just wanting clinics built or schools built. They want to become equity owners in the land. They want to become equity owners in the lodges. They want to see the training schemes become embedded into their communities. This is a very different concept, and it'll strain the relationship between operators and governments and communities. But that is where we're headed. And so true sustainability is conservation capitalism, as Jason said. You've got to kill what you eat, to use the safari terminology, or eat what you kill, to be truly sustainable in terms of revenues paying for conservation. And then this shared value situation between governments, communities, and operators is going to be at the epicenter of what sustainability actually means in the next few decades.
And so can I, since you've referenced, you know, the safari phrase that's beloved, why is it we so often have, well, these epiphanies, these moments, these life-changing aha moments whilst on safari, on trips like yours? Why is that?
Shall I give you 1 minute and then I'll hand over?
Because
going back to where I started, just look at the history of man, the origins of man. Our DNA is all traced back to the Afar Depression in Ethiopia, 3.2 million years ago. If you look at Lucy, which was the hominid discovered by Don Johanson, subsequent DNA testing across the whole world takes all humanity back to East Africa and into that valley. Whether we like it or not, when we go on safari, I believe that that's a visceral reaction to going back to survival of a species, to where we once came from. We might not know it when we're sitting in a vehicle in raw comfort and you've got a cappuccino on the front, but somewhere in there, you know, something can eat you. You know that it's a very, and then the people side of it is super important. When you come in, you go for wildlife, but you end up loving the people. So I think it's a combination of those two things.
Juliet, I would actually like to just build on some of those comments there. My internet glitching gave Joss the mic, thankfully. He articulated it better than I could. But yeah, the sustainability, there is no sustainability of a lodge or of a reserve if you don't look more broadly at that, at the community on the buffer zone, at the ecosystem that's acting as the watershed that's feeding the rivers. So, we have to move from a sort of a narrow species or certain place-based sustainability lens to a much more inclusive model. But, the conservation capitalism term might jar with some, but actually that brings about financial sustainability. And that we have to be pragmatic conservationists. But also inclusive. For me, sustainability is around inclusion because it's a much bigger play than a particular landscape. The Masai Mara and Kichwa Timber as an example, and the 20 conservancies that surround the Mara. If you don't conserve the Mao forest, which is the water catchment, there is no Mara in 20 years. So it's a much broader and more complex target, but it's the one that we need to achieve.
Thank you, Bjorn. Oh, I was meant to. I'm planning a trip to go to Kenya, and I was telling a friend of mine who's from there, and he said, "Yeah, you should." He said it casually. He said, "Yeah, you should, because your daughter, she just won't get to see those animals otherwise." And he said, it's changing. I think this is what we have to realize. The climate emergency isn't in the distance. It's right here. Things are changing, and it is vital to support this work. I really can't emphasize that enough. It really landed with me when they said that. So we're going to open to a few questions in a moment, but I'd like to ask you a question that I really would love to hear your thoughts. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing humanity right now? I know it's a big question to end on, but I'd really love to hear from your perspective what you think the biggest challenges are, and any ways that you're helping, and how we are helping as travelers, please. So, Beks, please tell us.
So my simple answer to that question, Juliet, is the nature of human beings' over consumptuous behavior. And, this is something that we all talked about in the height of the pain of COVID, where we were very hopeful that, emerging out of COVID, people will actually behave differently. I'm still hopeful that that is where we're headed as humanity. But, we're having very frank conversations that we've never had before about why it's important for us not to have certain things in camps. When guests ask, why don't you have this wrapped around plastic for hygienic purposes, or why aren't you serving this way? For us, we really are able to push back confidently and say, look, we need you to be part of the journey, and this is why we're doing it. So I think that over consumptive behavior of human beings, I think, is the biggest threat to not just Africa, but to the world. And particularly if you project what the scientists, and I hope some way that they're wrong, but when you see the projections of human population growth and you talk about consumption, particularly in Africa, we stand the brunt, I think, of the biggest risk of losing our wilderness areas.
Yeah, it's powerful. I mean, I know, Joss, I know that population growth is something that really concerns you. Explain, the causes and symptoms, and help us understand that better.
Well, to a chart with two arrows going in the wrong direction. When talking about Africa, the African population will double. I think it's by 2050.
How many countries in Africa? For those of us, obviously, it's a huge continent. There are, is it 55 countries? Sorry,
55, 56. Right. So it's big, but so you've got a doubling of the population in Africa. The actual amount of food production area for food production is going to go down 28 to 35%. So just when you need more food, you're not getting it because you haven't got the space to grow. You've got populations going up. Well, where do you think where's the pressure point? The pressure point is on the biospheres that Beks and I work in, that we're trying to preserve, that Bjorn is desperately, especially the frontier conservations that aren't benefiting from tourism today. The economic argument for there is, well, if you can't make it work, you tourism people, we're going to farm it. Corn is more valuable than impala. Sorry, we're doing it. So for me, the Confluence team, population growth, reduction of agricultural areas and the pressure that's put on very delicate biospheres, especially in those areas that either don't have consumptive tourism sitting on them, or indeed in some areas are actually protected by buffer zone hunting, which is another contentious conversation. But there is a place for that in this ecosystem in certain areas when you're just trying to preserve these very delicate ecosystems.
So Bjorn, what would your comment be?
So I would certainly reflect Beks and Joss's view. I think at the macro level, this consumption, out of hand consumption, and extreme population growth, those are very tightly correlated. Our major, probably our primary global challenge, but certainly at an environmental and a conservation level. And that really plays itself out into climate. So the climate emergency is really a result of consumption and unsustainable consumption and unsustainable population growth. So climate, but that's actually just an outcome of the former two. So it's a bleak picture, but not insurmountable.
Well, look, so thank you so much. We've only got 10 minutes left. We've got a few questions here. I'm just going to ask you, Jason, for your final thought on that, and then we're going to move to questions. Thank you so much. Jason, biggest challenge?
Sure. I think, there's no shortage of challenges that we face on this planet for sure. And obviously we've talked a lot about the, natural resources and conservation and all of those things, which I think in many ways are critical. But they're also in some ways symptoms in terms of the way I think about it, which is, I think in many ways the root cause, which is ultimately our biggest challenge, is one of empathy. Which is that I feel like that is probably the most precious resource and limited resource we have right now, and we need a lot more of it. And to maybe kind of try and bring this full circle is that I do believe that travel, and specifically safari, in my experiences for sure, has this magical ability to grow empathy in humans. And it's amazing, when you're in a situation where people come at a situation, come at a challenge with empathy, the whole game changes. And so I think our greatest challenge as a society, as a species, is that of empathy, specifically to manufacture more of it amongst all of us.
Thank you. It's a really powerful one. Empathy also, along with that compassion. Absolutely. I think it's absolutely critical. We have a few more minutes and we have some questions, so I'm going to race through those. One question we've got here is about conservation. For example, it's important. What role does voluntarism play? Is that good? What do we think on voluntarism? I'm going to ask you, Beks. Just quickly, we're running out of time now. Thank you.
So volunteerism as African bush camps is not something that we are big advocates of, but there are organizations that I believe really do it well. For us, we feel quite often there are solutions in Africa that we need to be empowering our people in our boundaries to be able to effect themselves. We have enough experts on the ground to be able to effect some of the things that we really need to do. And we quite frankly find sometimes it means that we have to dedicate management tools and resources that we're already short of to be able to manage people doing volunteerism, and that energy, I think, could go to other places. So in general, as African Bush Camp, it's not an area that we venture into. It's not something that we want to build as a business model. But that's not to say that there are other entities throughout Africa, or at least throughout the world, that do a very good job at it.
Anyone have another word on volunteerism at all?
Just a quick one from me. Broadly, I agree with Beks. Just tweaking that somewhat is, it depends on the skill set of the volunteer. Arriving at a location with an undeveloped skill set, as Beks said, that takes a lot of hand-holding and development from the people you're trying to support. But actually understanding what valuable skill set you have sitting in the developed market, whether that be a science skill set, access to capital, infrastructure, and deploying that. Now that's hugely valuable. So it's being quite focused on and understanding your value add rather than arriving and expecting to immediately contribute, because there's a long lag time before the value gets added.
Thank you. Thank you so much. We've just got a couple more questions. This is a really big one. I don't know who wants to tackle this, but what does the future of Africa look like according to the panelists, and how does it relate to their respective industries? It's a big question. Who wants to try that, Joss?
Lord.
Future of Africa.
Listen, having said what are the problems of population, I don't think we'd be doing what we're doing if we weren't passionate about it and we didn't think we could make a difference. I think at andBeyond that, if you asked any of our 2,000 employees what they get up for in the morning, it's certainly not working for me, right? It is, they're driven by that. They think they can make a difference.
No,
Things. And so I think actually, as I said, Africa, Africa's one of the greatest exports is its conservation models, of which the two other individuals here are in. The world should be learning from Africa. It's at the epicenter of those things. So I think it's not as gloomy as everyone thinks. It's got challenges though, but we will keep running at it.
And you're being too humble, because we do know that, people do want to work for a business that is spearheaded and led by somebody who is purpose driven themselves. So it's really, really important to acknowledge that. Also, Beks, do you have a comment on that? Future of Africa?
So, Juliet, I think quite often there's a lot of empathy in the world because people see the challenges that Africa has, that the world has, and people just put up their hands because they're just so overwhelmed with the amount of challenges and just the enormity of it. But I always go back down to basics and say, actually, every individual can make a very big difference in the day-to-day life choices that they make, whether it's simple recycling in your home, choosing not to use plastic, influencing your local grocery store not to dish out plastic bags. That's where it starts. And it's these small contributions that in total worldwide will contribute to making a remarkable difference. And we wake up every day passionate and doing what we do because actually we do believe that we can make a difference. And we know that it doesn't have to be a doom and gloom end of the journey. So I would say there is big hope, and certainly we're big advocates of it, and that's why we do what we do.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, I've got a couple more questions here. I'm going to read them both out, and I'm really keen to hear the answers myself. One is, how do you encourage travelers to want to travel with a purpose instead of traveling just for themselves? And I think we've touched upon that sort of tension between individualism and being more communitarian or being more aware of the wider we story. So how do you encourage travelers? And then the other one is, with the move to more sustainable tourism and tour operators having to be more conscious of their impact, because that's what travelers are looking for, is business going to be more difficult for traditional or old school operators as opposed to the new entries to the market? So, who would like to answer either of those? I'm going to say, Joss, come on. How do we encourage travelers to want to travel with purpose? How do we do it? Storytelling is how I think we should do it.
If I can answer the other one.
Okay. Okay. Well, look, Jason, you're a traveler. You're a traveler.
One could say that andBeyond was an old school operator, but I think you can teach an old dog new tricks, right? And I'd say we've made a very conscious effort to try and get ahead of that and not be a victim of being an old operator. I do think old operators who don't listen to what we're saying on this call, are dinosaurs. And you will get caught out. The governments, in terms of, you go to Botswana and try and get a lease in Botswana as a new operator. I mean, those concession requirements are very, very strict. We see it in Rwanda. We see it in other, where African countries and African governments are taking this very seriously. They want you to do the job properly. So a new entrant is going to have very high bars to come into, to get into the industry. So yes, I think old operators who aren't awake or listening are dinosaurs. But they can change, and they should change, and they will change because they're going to be forced to change.
So wake up. Yeah.
And Juliet, to your comment about how to get more people focused on this, you already answered the question. It's storytelling. That, at least my perspective is that, and this is where social media is probably the biggest friend of this whole topic, because there's nothing better than authentic storytelling of people that have been there and or people that operate these amazing experiences to truly and deeply share them in compelling ways through video, through imagery, through music. And so I think there just needs to be a lean into the storytelling of it all. That's what moves people. I mean, Out of Africa, the movie way back when, caused a huge increase in tourism to Africa. And so we've seen it happen in traditional linear ways. Now with social media, I'd argue the opportunity is so much bigger.
And last comment from me there, Juliet, is they're not mutually exclusive. You know, that traveler who's traveling for themselves, continue to travel for yourselves. Go to the destinations that you're passionate and interested in. Just do your research in the operators that you select, in where your revenue is going. Expose yourself. The aperture comment that Jason mentioned. Open that aperture and learn from those communities, from those ecosystems. Then you're traveling with purpose. So they're one and the same for me.
Thank you so much. It's been
What
really
I was going to add there really is just to say, you know, you've got very evident pictures in both Bjorn and Jason. Jason chooses places to go to because of the good that they do on the ground. Bjorn, on the other hand, is a business that will fund organizations that are actually doing good on the ground. So, you know, I think there's a collective responsibility in the tourism industry, and also with the people that travel to us, where it's our responsibility really to be able to tell the stories so that people make the right choices. And it's about bringing everybody to the journey. And we have this concept that we've been talking about throughout COVID, that you need to travel slow, travel deep. And that really comes from a yearning that there is so much education that we need to put out there to the rest of the world to understand the challenges and to also understand the potential victories that are ahead of us.
So I'm going to say, first of all, as well, thank you to everyone who came today. That's a big thing. That's a big help. First of all, that's a wonderful thing to do. To listen to this conversation, have more dialogues, look up from your phones when you travel, put the devices away, talk to each other. Really, just as Jason said, cultivate that empathy and really learn from each other. I'm going to quote Greta Thunberg, who I heard speak in London this week. Whatever your thoughts on the teenage climate activist, she also said, she said, one of the most important things we can do is educate ourselves about the climate crisis. That's important. And for me, how do we learn about that? We connect with nature. We understand its role firsthand. And I would urge everyone to take a trip and really experience that. Thank you so much. There are a few other questions. I'm sure that we can try and answer those offline as well. So we can hang back and share some thoughts online. Thank you to everyone, seriously, for joining us today, and to the panel who I learned so much from. Thank you.
Thanks, Juliet.